Now, Nick, you and I met at a crime awards in London a couple of months ago. Both of our books were nominated, shortlisted, but we were cheated, weren't we?
Oh, we was robbed.
We was robbed. But in order to, I suppose, pass the time, we did get chatting. And I thought, what a story you had. Having not been introduced to you or know your background until we got talking, really. So I wanted to bring you on so you can tell all the listeners about it. And I suppose first we'll describe that your book, Fugitive, which is an audio book published by Bonnier, and it's available on Audible or wherever people do get their audio books. But it's a kind of I would say it's a mix between a podcast and a book, because while you're narrating parts of the story, you're also interviewing some really interesting people.
Yeah, that's basically what it is. I mean, it could have just been a book in which I interviewed people and then would have tried to change their words into my own to sort of have just kind of one overall narrative. But it was actually John Watt, the head of Bonnier Audiobooks, who, suggested that it be done that way. He thought it would make it sort of more unique and more interesting. And then, of course, I've got the people that I'm interviewing. It's coming straight from their mouth as opposed to me kind of reinterpreting it in any way. And I think in that respect, it's quite unique.
It certainly is, and absolutely enjoyable. Now, we start really, I suppose, with your own story, because this is exactly why you interviewed some of these people. And the contributors, by the way, include the daughter of Howard Marks, Amber Marks, Ronnie Biggs, biographer Chris Pickard, and others, including the criminal psychologist Paul Britton, whose books I've read in the past. But the reason that you are speaking to these people about the whole sort of psychology and the experiences of being a fugitive is because of your own background. And because you essentially were yourself a fugitive with your parents many years ago. So first of all, give me a little bit about your background and tell the listeners who your father was.
Okay, well, my dad was Bruce Reynolds, who's been accredited as the mastermind of the Great Train Robbery, although it was a term he wasn't particularly fond of. I think he preferred to see himself as the grand architect of the Great Train Robbery. I was 1.5 when it happened back in August 1963. And subsequently, within a very short amount of time, majority of the gang had been caught. And it was generally my dad's modus operandi that after any crime that he'd done, and he was wanted for questioning, he would make sure that he wasn't available for questioning. In the case of the Great Train Robbery, his plan was to kind of lay down low for a bit. He actually thought that, and it's probably his biggest mistake, he actually thought that it would all die down after about 6 months. But once he started seeing the sentences that the robbers were being given, which was 30 years, which was 5 years more than you got for killing somebody back then, the maximum sentence was 25 years. He decided, well, let's get out of here. And so I spent 5 years on the run with him as a result of that.
And your mother, who he obviously loved very much.
And my mother as well, yeah. I mean, for her, she came from a very, very poor background. And so for her, it must have completely sort of blown her mind to have just been living simple life in England 1 minute and then whizzing around the world with one of the world's most wanted men and living, the high life, so to speak.
And of course, you were young, so you're piecing together your own story really through how you learned it as you got older, presumably from your mother and your father, and they told you stories about it, and you have memories yourself. of living in Mexico, etc. But bring us back to 1963 briefly, to that Great Train Robbery. And why did the police go after these guys, and did the law go after these guys so heavily? What was it about that train robbery that I suppose they were going to be made an example of, weren't they?
Well, that was really the major point, that the government was they'd already suffered a major blow, and confidence in the mind of the public, because just prior to the Great Train Robbery was an incident that's been referred to as the Christine Keeler affair. And this was a call girl had been caught having an affair with a guy called John Profumo. So it's also known as the Profumo affair. And he was a cabinet war minister. And not only was he caught having an affair with her, she was also having an affair with a Russian military attaché who was thought to have been KGB. And this kind of rather sordid bit of news was a big deal for the newspapers at the time, and they used it to their utmost to really embarrass the government. And literally, the government was kind of caught with its trousers down, so to speak. The British public back then, this is all pre-internet, and the papers were very, very biased in those days. They weren't allowed to kind of do the kind of scoops and exposés that they do now. And I think generally the public were quite naive as to what politicians got up to in their spare time, and they thought that most politicians were altruistic people who were proud of their nation and were doing everything for the benefit of the people. Mm. And so this was a rather kind of shock when they found out these sordid goings on behind closed doors in the Houses of Parliament, and it did shake the kind of comfy consensus of sort of middle-class England. And, the papers were they really, really made a meal of it. And so the government was deeply embarrassed, and it was in the wake of this that the robbery happened. So it really looked like from the government's point of view that they were losing their grip. And once again, the papers used the Great Train Robbery to deeply embarrass the government as well. And so
there was a sense that law and order was breaking down,
exactly. And the thing is, it was the biggest robbery of its kind. It was sort of unheard of to steal a train, and I think it was some bright spark at the. It's the newspapers that build these things up. Obviously, the robbery originally was referred to as the Cheddington mail van raid, which isn't very sexy and doesn't really sell papers. But it was some hack at I forget the name of the newspaper now, but he decided to call it the Great Train Robbery, which was named after a 1903 American movie, and. Even used the same font that they'd used on the poster to kind of evoke that romantic notion of the Wild West. And in those days, the cinemas all day long would run either cartoons or American Westerns, and American Westerns were a major import for the British TV viewership. So this whole tying it up with, Jesse James and the Outlaws and the old Wild West really kind of caught the public's attention. But the sheer amount of money was one thing, but the major thing really was the fact that it was the Royal Mail. So effectively, you could say it belonged to the Queen, and it was a direct assault on the establishment. And so the establishment, sought out to, as you said, make examples of them, which actually backfired. They thought that they were showing a strong hand by giving the train robbers 30 years. But it actually divided the public and unwittingly turned them into the mind of many people, sort of martyrs, if you like. They became sort of folk heroes, some of them, no matter how misguidedly that concept might seem today. That's how it was. They were seen as kind of working class heroes taking on this corrupt establishment.
And funny, I think those sort of armed robbers often do have that, that Robin Hood style, persona, don't they? And I think in this case, maybe the train driver was hurt, but there, this wasn't a sort of what you see in modern day criminality, which would be a lot of shootings. There's a sort of a lot of violence used. This was more cunning, I think. There was 15 robbers altogether, and they boarded that Royal Mail train travelling from Glasgow to London. They stole 2.6 million, which in today's money, I'm going to say about 60 million sterling, maybe 70 million euro. A lot of money, but a lot of people to be paid out of that, with 15 of them. And they went on to lie low in a farm where they hoped that the heat would die down, and where they famously played Monopoly with some of the cash. Now, it was in 120 bags, isn't that right? And as the time went on, they're either rounded up, or some, like your father, Bruce, managed to go on the run and have another great adventure doing that. So you, as you mentioned, were 1.5 when that happened. So you're presumably piecing together this story at this point from your mother and maybe from your father. But I think you and your mother you spent 2 trips travelling to Ireland when your father's lying low, is that right? And the first trip, the police watch you, but you only have a holiday. And the second trip is the one where you actually fly across the Atlantic and hook up with them in stateside.
Yeah, that's correct. But just before I go into that, you raised an interesting point where you're talking about armed robbers. Now the train robbers, they didn't have guns. They had pickaxe handles and pipes. But it's very interesting that because the establishment gave them such a big sentence, which was 5 years more than you got for murder back in those days, they inadvertently introduced gun culture into British crime, because from that moment on, you could almost argue illogically that, if you carried a gun and shot someone, you'd get 5 years less than what the train robbers got. So from that moment on, that policy didn't really work with the government. Most major criminals on a big piece of work after that would carry a gun. But yeah, going back to what you said about we went to Ireland. Straight away, basically after a while, my mum realised, there was no way that they could move around together. So my dad slipped away and on his own, and then my mum went to give herself up to Tommy Butler, the head of the flying squad. And, she walked in and said, look, my husband's left me. I don't know where he is. And he didn't believe her. And he kept her there for about 6 hours, questioning her, thinking that he could break her. Eventually, exasperated, he said, okay, well, I'm going to keep you in here for a week. I don't believe you. And my mum said, well, that's okay. I've come prepared. I've brought my toothbrush. So at that, he figured, okay, he'll let her go. But he had her and me under surveillance for quite a time. And we went to Ireland as a practice run, so to speak. And the first time we went out there, there were police hiding all over the place. It was ludicrous, even kind of hiding in bushes and things like that. And but when they saw that basically, my mum had gone to meet up with some of the other train robbers' wives, and when they saw that it was just a bit of a wives' reunion with their children, the next time my mum went out there, they didn't bother sending anyone to follow us, and that's when we ditched the passports and flew to Toronto from Shannon, and then on to Mexico to join my dad.
And you delve into it in Fugitive, your audiobook, because you speak to other people who had similar enough experiences as you. But it is kind of not the norm for fugitives to take their families with them. They're usually out there on their own. It's a lonely existence. But your parents seem to be very much in love. Your father, for all, I suppose, the excitement of his life and these heists, etc., he was very much a family man.
he was a true romantic, my dad, and he had a very, very close bond with my mum, I suppose. You know, they were pretty much inseparable. I mean, you know, when he did this robbery, he thought it was, you know, it was going to be his Sistine Chapel. He thought this was going to be the big one. And his real motivation at the time really was to do a job big enough so that, you know, the family could go abroad and live their life. You know, that was his drive. As you said, it's quite normal. Most fugitives, when they go on the run, they tend to be single people. And it can be of quite a lonely existence. Or if they do have family, they tend to get left behind because, you know, it's looking for one man is a lot harder than it is for looking for a guy if you know he's got his family in tow with him, you know, which is one of the main reasons why my dad decided, obviously, we had to go to a country that there wasn't any deportation laws or extradition treaties with, you know. But also Mexico, as my dad being a romantic, and at the time, you know, he used to love the Western novels, and he'd grown up reading about the exploits of Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid and the Hole in the Wall gang. And this concept of crossing Mexico to get to crossing America, to get to the border, to get to Mexico, was something that highly resonated with him, and it was, you know, it was the trip of a lifetime, and that's basically what we did. You know, we drove all the way across America, and ended up like outlaws in Mexico.
And presumably, because, you know, I don't know about you, I don't think I have memories of one vague memory before I was 18 months or in around that time, but most of your memories form a little bit later. So your first memories as a human being must have been of that time as a child with your parents in Mexico.
Well, funny enough, I've got a lot of vivid memories from that time. Partially, I suppose, some of them could be ghost memories that are formed in my mind from stories that have been relayed to me, obviously. But there was a fair bit of Super 8 footage that my dad filmed when we were out there in Mexico. And a lot of my memories are pretty much kind of like that footage, you know, they're just kind of random clips of certain scenes. But, you know, it's almost like it's an old movie that I remember seeing a few times, but, you know, don't remember all of it. But some of the imagery is very, very vivid, and the emotions that I had then from quite an early time. Probably my strongest memories that I recall are swimming around the swimming pool in the Hilton in Acapulco. They had a lagoon you could get to by swimming through a tunnel from the major swimming pool. And there was a major swimming pool, but there was also one that ran all around inside the hotel like a moat, you know, which I used to love swimming around that. But I used to jump off the top board with my hands around my dad's neck, and then we'd swim underwater to this hole at the side of the pool, and then swim through this tunnel, and we'd come out in the sea in this lagoon. I remember that very vividly. A lot of time sat in the back of the car listening to music. My dad loved driving, and I remember him giving my mum driving lessons, which was hilarious. And also them singing and dancing together, you know, quite a lot, specifically to Frank Sinatra's Songs for Swinging Lovers, which was a particular favourite of theirs.
I mean, the lagoon memory sounds amazing now. I'd love to do that as an adult. Your mum, Frances, was very much and totally in love with your father, and he was an exciting guy to be in love with. Didn't he bring her to Vegas and got her into the front row of a Frank Sinatra gig?
That's right, yeah. Well, they would often do kind of crazy things, like they would fly to Los Angeles for a steak or something like that. And I remember one time they went to Las Vegas, and my dad had got Frank Sinatra was performing there, and my dad had got sort of best seat in the house. And it was one of those old-fashioned type venues where you sit down and have a meal and drink your champagne while the band play. And they were sat right up at the front row. And my mum was wearing a green silk dress that my dad had bought her. And she had a big beehive in those days. It was a wig, and my mum wore a lot of wigs. And she caught Frank Sinatra's eye, who turned round and dedicated a song to her and said, "This one's for the Green Hornet over there." Now, the Green Hornet was a very popular TV show in America at the time. But as you can imagine, my mum was chuffed to bits. Never in her wildest dreams did she think, A, she'd ever get to see Frank Sinatra live, let alone be up close and have him dedicate a song to her.
Absolutely. Now, all the while, and they were obviously having a fantastic, living the dream really in Mexico, back in the UK, the attention never really went off the Great Train Robbers and the efforts to find them and, to track them down. So what happened in your dad's case? What mistakes did he make, and what brought this dream life and life as a fugitive to an end?
Well, it was various things. It wasn't just one thing you could you could argue that the dream started souring when Buster Edwards, one of the Great Train Robbers, he'd been on the run for, I think, for about 4 years. And he was struggling, and he got in touch with my dad and asked if he could come and join him out in Mexico. And so he came over, and whereas my dad had fitted in quite nicely, he'd bought the franchise for Dunhills, so he had a legitimate job out there. Obviously under an alias, posing as a British gentleman, if you like. And we were living with the top sort of 3% of Mexico at that time. And my dad was very good at fooling people into, letting them believe what he said he was. And Buster, on the other hand, wasn't as erudite. He was a terrific guy. But he was more your kind of lovable, cheeky chappy. And he didn't really kind of fit in with the kind of person that my dad was trying to be out in Mexico, and certainly with the kind of people that my dad was associated with. And Buster found it very, very hard living out there, him and his wife. That they found it quite difficult.
What do you mean? He was a kind of an egg and chip man who wanted back to Britain?
Yeah, I mean, I wouldn't put it so crassly, but it takes a very certain kind of character to be able to be in a foreign country and pull off the kind of person that my dad was, pretending to be. I remember as a child, I've seen many documentaries on the Great Train Robbery, but one that particularly stood out was when Detective Superintendent Harry Clements, who was part of the gang who managed to get the craze. He was, it always stuck in my mind, he was pretty much full of admiration and awe that my dad had managed to survive so long on the run in a foreign country, particularly in Mexico. My dad could pull off the suave English gentleman, quite well if he wanted to. He was very well read. And so could appear extremely educated, as were, a lot of his peers in Mexico were. And Buster just wasn't that kind of guy. But apart from that, he, as I said, he found it hard settling in there. And June, his wife, didn't particularly like it. And so he decided to do a deal and come back to England. Well, subsequently, it became quite clear that my dad realised that this had been a big mistake on his part, and it would only really be a matter of time before the police kind of managed to find out where Buster had come from. So one night we just packed up and left. I was devastated at the time because I was going to a school there. I had friends there, and we'd been there for nearly 4 years. And we then went to Canada and joined Charlie Wilson, It was another one of the train robbers he'd been arrested quite earlier on, but he'd escaped from Winson Green prison. And so he went and spent a bit of time with him, and it was during waiting to get Canadian citizenship that my dad felt something wasn't quite right and the process was taking too long, that we decided to quit Canada and then went to France. And it was probably just as well that we did quit Canada then, because it wasn't long after that Charlie Wilson got a knock on his door, and there was Detective Chief Superintendent Tommy Butler of the Flying Squad with 50 mounted Canadian police. So my dad had a narrow escape there. But we then moved, we were living in the south of France, and funds were running low. And so my dad decided to return to England to do another robbery. And so we moved to Torquay, got ourselves a nice place there. And he was toing and froing to London and back down to the coast. And word got out he was back. And I think to be honest, by this time, I'd been on the run sort of for 5 years, looking over your shoulder. That I think he was kind of getting tired, and he wasn't being as careful as he was before. It was almost, there was no way that he would give himself up, but it was almost like he was willing himself to be caught, so to speak. There was still a major reward out for his arrest anyway. And quite simply, somebody informed the police, and it was just a matter of time from there before they found out where he was staying. And then one fateful morning in November, I remember the doorbell knocking about 7 o'clock in the morning, and my dad shouted out, "Son, will you get that? It's probably Jane, the neighbour." And so I ran downstairs and opened the door, and in came a deluge of policemen. And that was that. It was, it was the end of the party, unfortunately.
And life changed for good. And interestingly, that's one of the areas you explore in your audiobook, Fugitive, with Amber Marks, the daughter of Howard Marks, and how she felt when the arrest of her father, and I think her mother as well, was taken, and they were left kind of without an adult.
Yeah, that's unbelievable. I mean, I didn't know that at the time. When she told me that, I was absolutely gobsmacked. I mean, in my case, my dad asked Tommy Butler if he could do a deal, and Tommy said, "Sorry, Bruce, I've got you down as the main guy." He says, "The only deal I can do is that if you plead guilty and give us what you've got left, I'll let your wife go. Otherwise, I'm going to arrest her as an accomplice." And he said, and obviously if that happens, Nick's going to have to be brought up either in a home or by relatives. So my dad pleaded guilty, and my mum, was there to look after me. So I was lucky in that respect. I was absolutely gobsmacked and horrified, as you said, when Amber's mum was taken away, along with Howard as well, and pretty much left to their own devices for quite a while.
Pretty terrifying for them as well. I'm sure you have a lot of sympathy and empathy for the children.
Well, yeah, but imagine she was just a teenage girl there, and suddenly had to kind of be the strong one around her siblings, who really didn't have a clue what was going on.
And I suppose things have changed, I'm sure, both here and in the UK when it comes to situations like that. Nowadays, I suppose other services will come with police, but it must be still very traumatic for children to see their parents being arrested, being taken away by police. It must be something that stays with the child throughout their adult life, no matter what their parent has done. When your father goes to jail and you go to boarding school, you continue a very strong relationship through letter writing. But what I wanted to ask you about was, I suppose there's a journey of understanding for you what your childhood was, that you were fugitives, that you were in Mexico. And did you ever ask your dad if he had have just stayed in Mexico, would you have still been there? Could he have survived there? Because With the business he had, the money possibly wouldn't have run out. It was when he moves again, he goes to Canada and then down to France, that the funds start to get tighter.
Yeah, if it hadn't have been for leaving Mexico, he would have been very happy living out his years. Like I said, we were living with the top sort of 3% of Mexico. We rented a penthouse in Mexico City off the president of the Bank of Mexico's son. And I went to a good school there. It was called the American School, and it was for the children of American diplomats over there. And he had a good circle of friends. He had a business partner with whom he owned the franchise of Dunhills. And it wasn't only Dunhills as well. The guy that he was in business with also was a major importer, exporter of carpets, and had his own clothing company.
And that was all legitimate business. So your father
that was all totally legitimate. So
his dream was to do the big one, the big heist, to make enough money to be able to give you a better life than he could have provided you with before, and presumably to, have a business that he didn't have to look over. So he got all that, but it was all, I suppose, it's all built on sand, isn't it? When you're a fugitive.
Yeah, I mean, I think it was a mistake, him leaving and going to Canada, because there was no extradition treaty with Mexico anyway. But I think it was just a gut feeling. I think that, he didn't want to be exposed, and probably he felt that he would have been deeply embarrassed and felt very bad about the people that, that friends that he'd met in Mexico, what their reaction would be, knowing that he'd been a total fraud. So obviously, even if they hadn't been able to extradite him, if he'd been exposed out there, he definitely would have lost the franchise. And probably a lot of backs would have turned on him. So ultimately, that dream would have soured anyway.
Yeah,
but
it was a matter of time, really.
Had he had decided to have stayed there, or had Buster perhaps never come to Mexico, my dad would have been very comfortable living out there, pretty much along the lines of Ronnie Biggs, living out in as many years as he did. In Brazil, having a fantastic time, sun, sea, and sangria. What more do you want?
You're still quite young when your father is brought away and sent to prison. I think you mentioned at one point that you kind of always thought he was a spy or something like that. When does the Great Train Robbery start coming into your consciousness, and do you start understanding what your father had actually done?
Quite late, actually. I don't. Looking back, I'm kind of amazed. I wasn't really more intrigued or wanted to know more about it. I mean, I used to go visit my dad in prison all the time, and the very first time I went to visit him, it took nearly half an hour just to get to him, because it was almost like the prison was like a maze with him in the center of it. And it seemed to take forever, with the guard and his big load of keys on his, on a ring, sort of going through each lock and then closing it behind, walking a few steps and opening a door and then locking it. And we finally got to the middle of this maze. There was my dad sort of just sat in a glass box. And I remember thinking, like Hannibal Lecter. And I remember thinking, my God, who is he that they've got him locked up like this? I'd seen prisons in movies, but never seen sort of anything quite like this. But despite that, and being aware of how long, that he had, that he was going to be locked up for, he was given 25 years. And in those days, there was no parole. So 25 years was 25 years. But despite all that, I don't really remember asking my dad a lot about it or showing much interest in it until I think I must have been about maybe 15 or 16 when a book came out, and it was serialized in the Observer magazine, which I always used to like because it had puzzles and cartoons in the back. And there was a serialization about the train robbers, and there was a picture of my dad on it. And it was in that I really got to know the story, and was amazed to find out that not only was my dad the ringleader of these guys, that also that my uncle John was a great train robber as well. I mean, he was acquitted. He was the only one actually who went to court and was acquitted. Mm. And I'll say that he was the only one. I mean, his prints were found on a movable object, which was the Monopoly board, and it was argued that his prints could have got on that board anywhere before it turned up and was found at the farm. And it's interesting to note, this is, the weight that the establishment had on the legal system at the time, that if the case was tried today on the evidence that they had, not one of them would have gone to jail for being a train robber. The worst case scenario they could have been was to say that they'd been to the farm, But anyway, that's another point. So yeah, it was only really till I was about 14, 15, I think, that I really that I kind of got to grips and realised, what my dad's story was and what it was exactly that he had done. And it wasn't long after that he actually, I think it was about a year after that book came out, that he came out of prison.
And you had been in boarding school, and you describe how you saw that as your prison, that you were doing time with your dad, and you loved getting the letters from him, and you obviously had a really strong relationship. But that story of the Great Train Robbery wasn't the worst thing to find out about him. I mean, you can imagine a scenario that somebody's father's taken away and sent to prison, and a far more sinister crime might be behind that. Did you see at that stage, I suppose, the legend that the Great Train Robbers were and were to become?
Not at all, because the background that I'd had, going to boarding school, etc. The kind of people I associated with, their parents were the kind of people that my dad would have targeted for robbery. There was a big stigma attached to people that had been to prison in those days. And although I couldn't say I was proud of him, I certainly wasn't ashamed of him. I was just very much aware that it wouldn't be good for me really to tell my friends or my peers who my dad was. So I pretty much kind of kept it a secret most of my life. I mean, when I was in the Navy, I was in the Navy 7.5 years, people didn't know about that, and whether they might not have let me in had they known that. And I certainly wouldn't have ended up spending time in naval intelligence had they had known that. So kind of growing up, it was something I kind of pretty much kept to myself. Mm. It was only really until the mid-90s when Lenny McLean came out of prison and he wrote his memoirs, The Governor, which became sort of a blockbuster of a hit. And therein followed a lot of 60s villains who had done their time were coming out and writing their memoirs. And for me, it was very fascinating to see how people that have been vilified by the media on one hand and in one period of time, roll on 20 years, were now being sort of feted on the celebrity circuit. And criminals were kind of viewed almost through like rose-tinted glasses, or at least 50s and 60s criminals appeared to be. And there was a bit of a sort of a gangster chic sort of phenomenon going on at the time, what with all these villain memoirs coming out and being bestsellers. And it was about this time that, even fashion kind of started harking back to 60s style clothes and things like that. And it was at that particular time that I felt how can I put it? I felt more comfortable, shall I say, talking about who my father was in this new atmosphere, if you like. And it was the first time in my life I can say that the response that I got was almost akin to as if my dad was a rock star of sorts in certain circles, which wasn't a way that I'd ever kind of thought about it, to be honest, up until that time.
And you were probably in a more sort of comfortable place yourself at that stage of your life. You had become, am I right, a musician and a sculptor. Your band, the Alabama Three, is the band behind the famous Sopranos theme. And maybe you were a bit more comfortable and mature in yourself, do you think, as well?
I think really it was the kind of people that I was associating with, really. Mainly artists and fellow musicians. And I think these type of people seem to have an affinity, if you like, for certain types of outlaws. And it was really in that kind of climate that I found myself, being at ease, talking about it. But some of my peers were kind of quite famous musicians who'd grown up. They were maybe 15, 20 years older than me. And for them, they'd grown up in the shadow of the train robbery, and they were very aware of it as children. And it was kind of quite a major, thrilling kind of part of their history. A lot, some crimes, can be viewed as despicable for some reason because of its nature, despite, as you mentioned earlier, the train driver getting injured by being hit over the head. It was still seen as kind of like, as a kind of romantic kind of caper. I mean, even in as much that they made a film called Buster, starring Phil Collins. And at that time, he was desperately trying to. He was working for the Prince's Trust, which is an organisation that was headed by Prince Charles, as he was then, and so he was working for the Prince's Trust, and he was hoping to get himself an MBE or an OBE doing various charitable works, and somehow or other, he got the role of playing Buster Edwards, one of the great train robbers I was talking about, who had a flower stall at Waterloo Station. And not only did he do a film portraying him, he managed to wangle a royal premiere gala performance at Leicester Square, where guests of honour were going to be Prince Charles and Lady Diana, until Alexander Walker, the critic of the Evening Standard, wrote a whole page, begging the prince not to go. So you're putting out the wrong message here. These are the guys, that went to rob the Royal Mail. Are you out of your mind? So subsequently, they had to cancel the Royal Gala, and it just became a in the Prince's Trust gala performance, and Phil didn't get his OBE, bless him. And I don't know if you've ever seen it. My dad used to refer to the film as Carry On Train Robbery.
Okay. Right.
It was a comedy, but the fact that someone back then at those times could have made a comedy about it just shows you how the robbery was viewed in general. I can't imagine somebody making a comedy movie about the craze unless it was in particularly poor taste.
Exactly. So your father, when he did come out of prison, your mother I think your mother died in some bad health, but he kind of went back to her and helped nurse her. Is that the situation?
Yeah, basically, my mum divorced my dad after about maybe 5 years in prison, because, as I said, he was sentenced to 25, and in those days there was no parole, so 25 years was 25 years. As it happened, in the interim, parole was introduced, and my dad came out after 10 and a half years, and within a year of being out, they'd got back together again. And they had 5 good years. And then she started having a series of breakdowns. Now, when my dad was in prison, she'd already had 2 nervous breakdowns and had been committed into a mental institution. And this was something that my dad had always felt kind of guilty and responsible for, thinking that, on one level, the stress of 5 years being on the run on one hand and living this kind of lifestyle, to then have it completely snatched away with you and finding out that you're a single mum, on your own with a husband who's locked up, the man of your life is locked away for 25 years. Something's got to give. And, my poor mum, she kind of suffered quite badly. And I said she had 2 nervous breakdowns then. And after they'd been together for 5 years, she started becoming unwell again and was diagnosed as a paranoid schizophrenic, manic depressive.
All right.
And she subsequently suffered another 3 major breakdowns, and was pretty much ill for the rest of her life. My dad didn't like the idea of her being, locked away in a home. He hated mental homes, and so do I. They're scary, dreadful, demoralizing places. They really are. I'm kind of almost haunted by the memory of having to visit my mum in these places. And he couldn't bear, even though she needed to be, looked after quite a lot in these kind of facilities and this environment. He couldn't bear to see her in that. So he kind of opted to pretty much kind of dedicate himself to looking after her. And she was only 68 when she died. She died quite young, and she'd been a tremendous toll on my dad. I mean, it was pretty much impossible for him to really do anything other than kind of look after her. He'd do all the shopping and the cleaning and stuff like that. And for a lot of the time, she was kind of pretty much bedbound. She'd have periods of lucidity, and he would really live for those moments. Sort of like there might be maybe two or 3 months in every year where he'd have his old wife back. But the rest of the time, it was a real struggle for him, and I think he got a lot of admiration from his peers because of that. And all the old ladies loved him, of course, because most of the villains of my dad's period or era, if you like, had all dumped the wives and mother of their kids for the young Dolly type. And the fact that my dad had remained faithful and stayed with my mum said an awful lot about his character. And obviously, as I said, the old ladies, loved my dad. He was a charmer. But he really loved my mum.
It says a huge amount about him. I mean, it makes him a lovable character, even the way you describe him there. And clearly somebody with a very strong moral code, that he did stay with her. And he, that love they had together in Mexico wasn't just about the money and the lifestyle. It was obviously something deeper that was there between the two of them.
Yeah, well, I think exactly. I think those 5 years on the run had forged, a tremendously strong bond. I mean, it did with me and my dad. There's that old Jesuit saying, give me a boy for 7 years and I'll show you the man. So I'd probably spent more time with my dad in those 5 years than most kids get to spend with their dad until they're in their teens, Mm. So, but yeah, it was a tremendous love story. I mean, I've still got all of their letters, and they're so beautifully read. People used to write letters in a way that they don't today. It's almost an art form. If I've even considered maybe publishing them one day, they're so beautiful. But they had a tremendous relationship. They loved each other dearly, and as I said, my mum was 68 when she died, and my dad died just coming up to 2 years after she had died. I remember being with him the last few days of his death, the last few days of his life. Mm. And I remember him saying to me that, with now that I'd grown up and everything, and he was old, that that my mum was his life, and without her, he didn't really see the point of going on, and he was tired, and he wanted to. He was quite happy to go, but and that I was the only thing holding him back. Don't say that. That's a terrible thing to say. Put it on me. And he died that night, as it was. And
he was 80.
They often 81. Say that people. Sorry,
he was 81. Nick, was he?
Yeah, he was 81. Yeah, it was just coming up, funny enough, to the what would have been the. He died in February, and August that year would have been the 50th anniversary of the train robbery. Of which he wasn't looking forward to. He said to me, "I'm just going to unplug the phone and hide." He was kind of pretty much sick to death of it by then. In fact, he was so determined that he wasn't going to talk to the press or anything like that, or do anything for it. That me, him, Ronnie Biggs, and Ronnie Biggs's ghostwriter, we all kind of collaborated together and knocked out a book, and we thought, well, that'll be the last word for the 50th anniversary, and that will save them having to say anything,
Yeah.
But unfortunately, my dad wasn't there for the 50th, and although Ron was, he died shortly afterwards, as did my uncle John, and in fact, they're all dead now. All the train robbers.
So. Sort of 10 years on or thereabouts in recent years, you have been putting your thoughts together about really, I suppose, that period of your childhood, about being your father's son and your mother's son, and about the sort of elements of being a fugitive, what type of a person can be, what life is like, how they do it nowadays. And you've kind of mixed your own musings on these topics, as well as talked to some very interesting characters. Is it Zahid Khan that you were speaking to that's currently, or certainly when you were at the time of recording, was a fugitive and away from his family?
Yeah, he was in Dubai. He'd been convicted of fraud. And
he had reasons he didn't want to serve that sentence. He didn't believe it was
exactly. Well, he thought he thought that the charges against him were unfair, and that he was going to go down for longer than he was due. So he basically fled to Dubai, where he was hoping that he could maybe broker some deal or something. But he found it incredibly hard because, he'd left his family behind.
I was going to say, I found it interesting that he spoke about how he goes on FaceTime and walked the children to school, essentially. And there's all these sort of modern tools nowadays that...
that must have been absolutely heartbreaking for him. I mean, the closest I got to that with my dad was when he was at Durham Prison. I used to wait in the car park, and he said to me on the way up to his cell, if I looked up at a certain window, from if I was in the car park, I'd see a little hanky, and that was him waving through the window just before he go into his cell, and that used to bring such a lump to my throat, But I can't imagine if I'd been able to speak to him every day or something like that. I think that would have actually made it a lot harder. So for him doing that, I think would have brought him comfort. I mean, it might have brought comfort
to the child.
To the child. But for him, it must have been heart-wrenching and must have, heart-aching, I would have said. I mean, subsequently, he did nearly 5 years, and he gave himself up, actually, and he came back to the UK.
Yeah, because
and decided that it faced the music. There's a point in your life where you suddenly go, hold on, I can't live like this anymore, and I better go back and take my chances. The quicker it's over and done with, the quicker you can be back with your family. That rationale does come into your mind.
And maybe as you describe your own father, you just get tired. You just get worn out and weary of looking over your shoulder and knowing.
You do. It takes a tremendous, a rare kind of character, I think, to be able to go on such an adventure like that, where, you know, every little noise, any slight thing goes wrong. You're so easy to have paranoid thoughts, you know, and that looking over your shoulder, or if you hear a loud noise or there's a tapping on the door or on the window, you're thinking, hello, who's that? You know, it must, you know, being on high alert must, you know, must just fill you with so much anxiety. I mean, I couldn't do it. I really couldn't. It would drive me absolute nuts. I'd be convinced all the time. Anybody looked at me in an odd way, I'd be thinking, oh, they know, it's game over, you know.
For sure. And stress is, I mean, it has to be the thing that is the worst for your health of anyone who's...
Yeah. I think you've got to enjoy it, you know, and I think for quite a few years, my dad enjoyed the performance, you know. I think he must have seen himself as a bit of an actor, you know, and as he said, the thing about crime for him, what interested him about it, I mean, he was a bit of an auteur. He loved movies. And he said the best thing about being into crime is, he said, you know, you get to be the script writer, you get to be the producer, you get to be the director, and you get to star in it, you know.
Absolutely.
But, you know, that feeling, I think, of elation and of playing a game, so to speak, you know, that wears off with a hard touch of reality.
For sure. Well, we're going to, in our next episode, play an extract of your book, Fugitive, and which is new thing to us here on podcasting. Of course, we can run extracts of audiobooks in the same way people used to read extracts of books in newspapers. So I'm all for this. But in the meantime, we missed you recently in Ireland. The Alabama 3 were playing here.
Yeah, I'm sorry about that. It's just our schedule was a bit hectic. I was looking forward to meeting up and having a Guinness or two.
So listen, I'm sure you're coming back again soon anyway. And anybody who's interested in your art, have you a website with all that on it?
Yeah, I do. I have a website called deathmasks.london.
Yeah.
And another one called reynoldsandrose.co.uk.
Nick, thanks so much. And thanks a million for coming on and telling just a little bit of your story.
Thanks very much. And hopefully I'll see you in Ireland.
I'm Nicola Tallant and you're watching Crime World, a podcast about criminals, drugs and the underworld in Ireland and across the globe. Make sure you subscribe to our channel and turn on notifications so you can be the first to watch all our latest episodes. You can also listen wherever you get your podcasts.